Hey, everybody, it's Michael Angelo Caruso. Welcome to the Talk to Me podcast. This is episode 40. If you had the pleasure of hearing episode 39, you heard from David Dino Terrace, the blind motivational speaker, very inspirational. And this week, we've got an old friend of mine, RJ King from D Business Magazine on. How are you, RJ?
Great to see you, Michael.
You are a local hero. I don't know if you think of yourself that way, but with your background in the D and your new book, you are on fire, baby. The new book, everybody, is called Detroit, Engine of America. It's out by Momentum Books, and it's a beautifully crafted book. Did you have some say in the design, RJ?
A bit. The circle that you see, we call that the medallion.
Yeah.
I did the initial design, and then we had two designers work on that, and then we had our overall designer, Kevin Martin, put the whole thing together.
I love the
Did a great job.
rounded edges, not only on the cover, but also on the pages on the inside. I don't know what this is called. It reminds me of a classic book, like a Bible or an old reference book. What is this called? Do you know?
It's called a page mark ribbon, and obviously red silk.
Yeah.
And we gave it a classy touch with that, and the rounded corners. It's like a journal, so it's meant to evoke like a fieldman's guide or an explorer's guide to Detroit.
Yeah, I love it. It's an excellent book, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what it was like to write it and some of the little and big surprises that you uncovered. Before we
Sure.
do, everybody, you should know that my friend RJ is the editor of not only D Business Magazine, but D Business Daily News as well, and also the Detroit 500. He has and his team have won 30 plus editorial excellence awards. And he cut his teeth in the journalistic trade, everybody. He wrote for the Detroit News over 4,000 articles, most of them business-based, and you currently serve on many boards in the city. So not only are you involved with the past of Detroit, but you're also involved with the present. Congratulations, man. We went to your book signing. There were lots of people there. There's a lot of excitement about this title. How do you feel?
I feel great. It fills a niche. There wasn't really a book out there that explained just basically how this manufacturing powerhouse was built in the middle of the wilderness.
Yeah.
The fort went up in 1701 by the French, and you're literally cut off from the East Coast because there's no way to get here other than by portaging by canoe or boat to get to Lake Ontario, and then you could get to Detroit.
Yeah.
So you think about how this was built. The citizens had to be very self-sufficient, and it's still that way today. You can literally build anything here.
Yeah, it's an amazing history, and I've never seen it delineated in the way that you do in this book. Some little surprises I tripped on as I was reading it is that Detroit is one of the few cities that's actually older than the country itself.
Right. Founded in 1701 and older. It's the oldest city in the Midwest, even older than Pittsburgh. The first chapter takes you from 1600 to 1800, and it explains of the four superpowers of Europe: France, Spain, England, and the Dutch. And the English and the Dutch settled the East Coast. Spanish went down south, and the French came up the St. Lawrence and discovered Quebec, Montreal, and then Detroit in 1701, and then Ohio and Kentucky, and that was all called like New France. And that was a way to keep the English and the Dutch from expanding too far westward. There was a lot of gamemanship going on back then.
Gamesmanship, indeed. There were a lot of players vying for position. The British were involved. The Native Americans were involved. The French were involved. And under all of this, the American settlers are trying to carve out their own territories. You mentioned that the first chapter is a 10-year period. That's how the book's laid out, everybody. 1700 essentially to 1709, then the next 10 years. And what I liked, RJ, is you provided the population, I assume from the census reports or maybe another document, which shows how the city is growing. In 1700, the population was only 100 people. By 1850, 21,000, and by 1890, 205,000. That gives us a visual of how things are moving in the city, that and your great narrative.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the first chapter is 1600 to 1800, and then it's by decade after that, and it really explains how the city was built and the major milestones. So, 1800 to 1810, you had the Great Fire of 1805, and how the streets were laid out after that under Judge Woodward's plan. And then the next decade, the major thing was the War of 1812, where we had surrendered the city to the British for a few months and got it back. And over the course of its history, Detroit was settled by the French, and then it became British, then it became American, and finally in 1796, and then the War of 1812, and then after that, I mean, it just sort of just took off.
Yeah.
And
I lived in Michigan my entire life. It was so fun uncovering these names that I know as building names or county names or city names, names like Macomb and Cass and Hamtramck. These were all real people back in the day who did great things for their community, and I suppose they were honored by having streets named after them or buildings or counties named after them. That's kind of how it went. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of my favorites was William Macomb. He was a soldier in the army, and during the War of 1812, the British were attacking southern lake near Buffalo, and so they had a whole winter to prepare for their invasion. What they did was they built a lot of roads into the forest, and then as they went down, they got narrower and narrower and narrower until the troops got clunched up, and then our guys just went in there and got them. So lots of gamemanship going on, and just amazing. And his statue is right out front of the Book Cadillac Hotel.
Yeah, yeah. If it can be said, I think I'm doing the numbers right, that this book is primarily about the 19th century or the 1800s. Am I doing that right?
Correct.
And at one point in the book, you say that if we were to focus on one person for the first half of the century, it would be Cass, Lewis Cass, and in the second, a gentleman by the name of Pingree. Can you talk a little bit about those two heroes?
Well, Lewis Cass, he was the first governor. He was involved in the Revolutionary War. He grew up in Boston, was in Ohio, and then he came here, was appointed by President Thomas Jefferson, and really was the guy that brought us out of the wilderness into a modern city, had very high standards, and was very well respected. And he was governor for 20 plus years, and then went on to the U.S. Secretary of State and a number of other titles.
Yeah.
And then, so he was the most,
twice, yeah, Cass?
Pardon?
He also ran for president twice.
Yes, he did. And he lost on both occasions. But very famous guy. And then in the second half of the century, you mentioned Mayor Hazen Pingree, and he came here after Civil War, and he was a shoe maker by trade, and he was credited with sort of being the first labor activist. He was a corporate guy at first, if you will, and then in the middle of the 1880s, there was a strike at his company, and it lasted several months, and he began over time to sympathize with the activists, the workers, and changed his whole opinion around. And when he became mayor in 1889, he was a champion of the people. He took on the monopolies that were in the electric industry, the water industry, the natural gas industry, cleaned all that up, was instrumental in building up Waterworks Park. During the great economic panic of 1893, he allowed people to farm on vacant city property, so he became Potato Patch Pingree was his nickname, and he went on to be governor of Michigan as well.
Pingree, not Pingree. Thank you for the correction.
Oh, no problem.
I think it's one of the greatest traits of a leader is the ability to change one's mind if new information or new data presents itself.
Oh yeah, yeah.
In modern day, we've named it flip-flopping. That you, even if you got new information, you're not allowed to change your mind because that makes you look weak. So how interesting to hear that Pingree was able to reformat what he was thinking about important issues of the day. We mentioned, and you mentioned in the book many times, the tumult from which this city grew. first there was no government, and then there were two governments. And we were so disorganized in the early days, we didn't even celebrate the centennial, the first 100 years. It was because we were finding ourselves, yeah?
I think there probably was celebration. It's just that there was no records of it. And, from day one way that the settlers were able to attract other people was that we had liquor, brandy and things like that. There was some discussion of getting rid of it, and Cadillac and others argued there's just no way that we'll get anybody if we don't have something to provide for them. So, all from the very outset, they had a very crude tavern that was popped up, and they ran that. It's obviously been going on for a long time, and the city actually had a lot of problems with perhaps having too much fun.
Some things never changed.
Yeah.
40 days in the early 1800s, 40 days to send a letter from Detroit to DC on a special road, the only road that actually took you to DC. It's hard to imagine today the slowness that things must have happened. Of course, they didn't have anything to compare to, but and also so many other little surprises in the book as I was reading. That the Detroit Yacht Club, not the current version, but the one that's there now, which was, of course, it was an iterative thing. They add on to it. There's a fire that they replaced part of it, whatever. This happened in many, many buildings. But the current Detroit Yacht Club is the largest yacht club in the country.
Yes, that's correct. And it was started in the 1850s. I have to look back for the exact year.
Yeah.
Maybe 1849. But it was where the Stroh River place was. That's where it originally was. And several of the other boat clubs were there as well. And they had done many, many novel things that, the first regatta and things like that. So we were big into sailing.
If you need to look it up, I have the book.
Okay, that's great.
Tell us about James A. McGinnis. I recognize the name because I just watched a bio about the Barnum and Bailey circus. But most people don't know the story of James McGinnis. It's fascinating.
Yeah, there's actually a plaque of him at Cobo Center, and that's where they originally had operated the circus. And then, one thing led to another, and he hooked up with Barnum and Bailey, and they were instrumental in putting the zoo on railroad and coming into towns all over the country, and must have been just an exciting time because there wasn't much to do.
Yeah.
You think about it: no TV, no radio, no internet. You had books, and then you had live entertainment.
Yeah. In the biopic that I saw, people would go to the circus and be able to pet an elephant, touch an elephant, and there would be no way to feel that texture anywhere else in any other time in their lives. And so it was such a unique experience that stuff just shut down when the circus came to town. It was the big annual event. And what really interested me about McGinnis is, like, he really went into the circus full tilt. He actually changed his name to James A. Bailey, if I read it right in the book, who was one of his mentors. He became this guy, and that's the Bailey in Barnum and Bailey, this guy that just kind of made the circus his own. It's a remarkable story.
Yeah. So, and you have that, and just so many characters that were prominent in the city's founding, like R.L. Polk and Sanders and Stroh's and all those great names that we've known. They're all got a place in the book.
For those of you watching from other parts of the world, Stroh is a very famous ice cream history in Detroit. And Stroh was a beer, and Sanders was ice cream. And they were like very favorite brands, just like Verner's ginger ale was in Detroit. Sure. But if you travel outside of Detroit and talk about Verner's, a lot of people don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Verner's is a pretty national brand. Sanders somewhat.
Yeah.
But they're both still around under different iterations, but those names you can still see them in the grocery stores.
This was a bit of trivia that caught me by surprise. Apparently only one U.S. president has ever lived in Detroit.
Yes, Ulysses S. Grant from 1849 to 1851, and he loved Detroit, and he had the fastest horse and won many a race on 4th Street on Saturday afternoons. That was
Yeah.
a very popular thing to do, horse racing back in those days. And then, of course, he was moved out to upstate New York and then out to Oregon, and he got into too much drinking again, and was given a choice of being court-martialed or resign his commission. He resigned his commission, and then when the Civil War broke out, he convinced the Illinois governor to give him control of the brigade, and he fought. And Lincoln loved the guy because there were several other generals that were trying to position themselves for the 1864 presidential election and going slow on the war. Grant didn't care about any of that. And then when the war ended in 1865, he came back to Detroit for 5 days for just a hero's welcome. And I can only imagine what the party was like.
Yeah, because there was drinking involved.
I'm sure there was.
But what's interesting about Grant becoming general is he had kind of washed out, like you say. And some historians paint a picture that Lincoln was working his way through all these other generals, none of whom could win the war for him. And in some ways, Grant was his last chance or his last choice. And it's just weird how things work out. But Grant got a lot of credit for essentially winning the war. I don't know how much of that's on him, but he was certainly in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, between Grant and William Sherman, those two gentlemen really did their job well.
That's right.
And Grant, whenever he was approached later in life, when the subject of Detroit popped up, he just lit up, eyes sparkling. He just loved this city.
I'm not sure Grant was around during the time of the building of the 12-story Chamber of Commerce, which you mentioned is now the oldest oldest existing skyscraper. I can't remember if it was in the country or in the city. The oldest existing skyscraper.
Oh, it's in Capitol Park, which is in downtown Detroit. And it's now apartments, but for a time it was the headquarters of the Archdiocese of Detroit. Yeah. It's where Comerica Bank had its headquarters for quite some time.
Yeah.
So it is a rather famous building.
I don't know if I was reading into things because I know your background in journalism, but it seemed like you spent a lot of time, or maybe even, if I'm reading between the lines, relished your research on the rich journalistic tradition in the city of Detroit. You note in Detroit, Engine of America, that in 1895 there were 80 everybody, newspapers, 7 of them dailies. What could it have been to be alive back then, RJ, with so many opinions being published and editorials and so much news available? One might argue there was less going on, but more news available. How did that work?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it goes back to you really had no other competition. In the early days, it was a town crier, literally marching down the street with the bell, announcing the week's events, or if a child got lost and all those things. But as the printing press and industry got more evolved, those papers were just highly thought of. And there were so many niches that you could do. There would be some for Catholic, some for agricultural equipment. So you had both, general news and then, what we would call today trade publications.
Yeah. Amazing time. Let's tell some stories. The founder of Detroit was a guy with a magnificent name, definitely a triple word score in Scrabble. We all call him Cadillac now. What was his full name?
Antoine Delamuth Cadillac. And
that's like a song, complete song lyric.
He first came to Detroit in 1687, as cited in the book, to scout the area, and then it took 14 years up to 1701 for him to get the money from King Louis XIV, and his finance minister was Count Pontchartrain, which is a famous name in Detroit. And they came in June, literally this month in 1701, and started building the fort, and then hunkered down for the first winter. He was innovative in that beaver pelt trade was sort of the currency of the day, if you will, because
Yeah.
you didn't really have a lot of silver and gold coins, very hard to mint in those days. But the merchants up in Quebec and Montreal were very jealous of him because they traded with the Native Americans directly, where Cadillac at Detroit, he hired the Native Americans to go out and get these pelts and would send them up to Quebec, Montreal, and then on to Europe. And they were slow to pay him. They would try to undercut him. And then Cadillac complained to Count Pontchartrain, and so Pontchartrain said, well, go to Quebec and let's get this thing straightened out. So 1704, he goes up to Quebec and they put him in jail. And it took him a year to get through everything and go through a trial that was presided over by Pontchartrain. And he came back and pretty much got back into the same business. And that lasted until 1710. And so finally Pontchartrain just sort of thanked him for his service, saved everybody face, and governor of Louisiana. And that was that.
Favorite fact about Cadillac was a domestic fact that he had 13 children and that only 3 were alive when he passed away. That was another thing that was happening back then. We had typhus, we had infant mortality. It was a hard life, and Detroit winters weren't any softer than they are these days, right?
No, they're not. The one thing that the populace had was, the 3 main industries that sustained them were fishing, farming, and hunting. And then in the 1750s, we got into shipbuilding.
Yeah.
And that's, started when things got to really sort of take off. There were no roads, so everybody kind of hugged the river. All the farms hugged the river, and then the inland rivers like the Rouge and the others that. So you transported goods and services, goods by boat to the downtown, and then again, not a lot of currency, so there was a lot of bartering and trades.
In 1812, this young country declared war against. I had to read this like 3 times because it seemed like an impossible thing. Think about this, everybody. This young country, barely organized, fighting so many things besides actual battles. They declared war against, do I have this right? England, Ireland, and Canada at the same time?
Yes.
The balls in those guys.
Yeah.
Wowie. And we persevered.
Yes. We were, on our home court, so to speak. So that's where the war was going on. What precipitated it was that the English in Napoleonic France were engaged in a war, and the English accused us of supplying the French. Of course, we were, and the English had commandeered several thousand of our citizens to man their ships. And you would think, oh, why would they do that? Well, there's no other place to go, right?
Yeah.
So we declared war on England, and it involved Canada and Ireland as well. And like I said, in a matter of a couple of years, we won that. It's often referred to as the Second American Revolution.
Okay. And then again, woven in this tapestry of the century, all these little inventions and discoveries that happened. The invention of matches in 1812, iron pipes being used for the first time in 1838, and the typewriter making a debut, I think, in 1868. Did you think when you were writing the book, did you get a feel that one of these inventions maybe meant more than another, maybe something I haven't mentioned? You said something about matches that up until the time of matches, which I had never really thought of this, up until the time of matches, the solution was to not let the candles burn out, not let the torches burn out. I guess they were using oil, huh?
No, they were using candles that they literally made from boiling plants. And you literally did have to keep a candle burning all the time. And then at night, they would put ashes over the embers so that in the morning they could get the fire going. Yeah. And you literally had sentries up and down the streets going on at 9 o'clock, and they would say, it's 9 o'clock. And then they would say curfew, and curfew was the French term for covering the embers. And then, of course, curfew today is, lights out.
Fascinating. I think my favorite character, we'll talk about this guy and then talk about some lessons that we can draw from history. My favorite character was known as the boy governor. Can you talk a little bit about this guy? I thought he was fascinating, and he didn't live very long, this guy.
No, Stevens T. Mason, and it is Stevens, and he came here in the late 1820s, and kind of sort of an errand boy, if you will, to Louis General Cass, Governor Cass, and Governor Cass quickly took a shine to Mason, and when he was away, he was sort of his PR guy, if you will. Yeah. Did a very good job of it, and the citizens elected Mason to be their leader, 1834, 1835, and he was really pushing for Michigan to become a state. And long story short, he was successful with that. But along the way, after the election, they had earmarked $5 million to build new railroads and things like that. It didn't go too well, and so he was up for re-election. He lost, and then he left Detroit, went back to the East Coast where he grew up, and unfortunately, soon after, he passed away. But the youngest governor in Michigan, and I believe one of the youngest, if not the youngest, in the country.
Age 21 or 22 when he was governor?
Yes.
That's amazing. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And he died at age 31, everybody. Do we know what he died of?
I can't recall.
Yeah. And in fact, a lot of times they didn't know what people died of. It's funny, especially with the women, they described that she just died. Either couldn't figure it out or they didn't care enough to figure it out.
Well, they probably couldn't figure it out. But his statue is in Capitol Park, his grave and a statue to commemorate his life is in Capitol Park, where the first state capital was. And Detroit was the first state capital. And then they waited 10 years and everybody competed to be the capital. They decided on Lansing because it was centrally located. But interestingly enough, the University of Michigan was started in Detroit in 1817. They put their hat in the ring. Somebody had donated 40 acres. When they lost out on being the state capital, voila, they got the University of Michigan to move to Ann Arbor, and that's why it's there today.
Why do we keep talking French when we're in Detroit? Voila. It's good.
Yeah.
Stevens T. Mason was one of many, many interesting characters in the founding of Detroit. We're talking about R.J. King's new book, everybody, Detroit, Engine of America. R.J. is the publisher of D Business Magazine. If you're in the D, you want to check it out. It's a fantastic publication. R.J., what can we learn from the past? I was taken in two different directions as I'm reading your great book. I'm thinking that's cool, that's unusual, that's cool, that's great, how unique. And then the other side of me is like, didn't all cities start to develop along sides of the water? Didn't all cities name their first 5 main streets after U.S. presidents? How unique is Detroit in the big picture? Don't all cities go through the same kind of development process?
They do, but because we were so early in the game, again, oldest city in the Midwest and older than the country, this city had to be self-sufficient, and you're cut off from the East Coast up until the Erie Canal opened in 1825. If you were going west, this was the place to come. It was a celebrated frontier town, got great reviews, and the first wave of immigrants, for example, were the Irish in 1808, mainly because as Catholics, they were being persecuted by the Protestants and others on the East Coast, and they came here during the summer months in those years because the French were Catholic.
Yeah. And
the first, St. Patrick's Day parade was 1808, and it's been going on ever since.
Wow. What about things that seem to be recurring, or cycling, what can we learn from history about? I noticed in the book you mentioned in 1810 there were no bookstores. We're actually losing our bookstores again. Is this a cycle that we can expect in certain regards?
Well, in 1810, they were correct. There were no bookstores. It was basically a logistical problem. There was only 300 volumes of books in the entire city.
Wow.
So if someone had a new book sent to them, the town would be, on their tippy toes trying to like read it, get a copy of it,
Yeah.
Have it for the night, read it at a crowd. And then over time, we did get the printing press here. Father Gabriel Richard, who was a leader of the community, both spiritually and civically, helped get the printing industry started here. I think one of the lessons that we could use today and into the future is you see so much division in our political process, especially in Washington, D.C. There's always been political differences over time, but Detroit was able to rally around or kind of go above and beyond it when needed, mostly when an emergency occurred. We talked about the Great Fire of 1805, but there were many other fires throughout the 1800s that would just take down city blocks. And just imagine the devastation that and just the fear that would create in people that, their house might be next. They literally would tear down houses and get the wood out of the way so that the fires, couldn't spread out. You just think about, like the Detroit Free Press, they were out of commission for 8 months because a fire had consumed their entire block.
Wow.
And there's not like they can't go down the street and get new printing equipment, right?
You mentioned divisiveness, and in the book talk about the race riot of 1833. As a citizen of Detroit, of course, the race riot of 1967, and there have been at least 2 others, I think, in between. I read a book like Detroit, Engine of America, and I think to myself, well, if we can get enough people to read this, we can learn from it and we can fix stuff. Will race relations ever be fixed? Or when somebody writes a book about 21st century Detroit, will there be mention of race riots and racial strife? What do you think? Can we ever get better in this regard?
I think we can, and I think we have. I believe that we need to have, a way for everybody to have a chance to afford a home or a nice apartment. And I believe that we need to do a better job with our public schools in Detroit, especially, to provide a quality education, because these kids are innocent. They don't have any say in the matter, so to speak. And it is getting better. And I think what we could learn from this is that, we have to be inclusive. We have to, treat people all the same and look out for each other and provide a way forward so that people can have the opportunity to learn a skill, a trade, a profession.
Yeah.
And the more we do that, the better we'll be.
There's an old saying, probably from the French, that in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you came from. And
Sure.
like this help us with that. Thank you so much for putting it together. This is, again, everybody, Detroit, Engine of America. It's by R.J. King, and it's available from Momentum Books. I assume it's momentumbooks.com, yeah?
Correct.
Very good. Thanks for all you do for the city, R.J. You're a fantastic patriot and spokesperson for not only the city of Detroit, but the state of Michigan, and we really appreciate you. Best of luck with all of your endeavors, and I hope you sell 1 million copies.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for being on your show.
Pleasure.
It was wonderful.